posing a question, or offering an interpretation of the question that I guess we've all asked at various different points, those of us who have an interest in realism, which is the proliferation of realisms over the course of the last 30 years. Kenneth Waltz, as some of you will know, was on at a conference in Aberystwyth a couple, 2-3 years ago, and made the point in his closing remarks that he was a bit puzzled by the proliferation of realisms, and particularly by neo-realism and structural realism and all of this, since he always just called himself a realist. And when he was writing Plans to Make War, and even into the 60s and 70s, of course, until what we might call the Waltz industry got going after the publication of the Theory of International Politics in 1979, this endless subdivisions of realisms into neo-structural, neo-classical, classical, etc. didn't happen. The other thing that obviously is very noticeable is the very, very pronounced difference of methodological approach and style between, say, later realisms, even when handled by somebody who is by no stretch of the imagination a neo-positivist like John Mearsheimer, or somebody who is methodologically extremely eclectic like Rengger. It's very clear that there is a pronounced difference between, say, Morgenthau or Niebuhr and Mearsheimer, or however much Ed thinks he's writing the accents of Morgenthau. There are clearly very profound methodological differences between them. And then the question is whether it's reasonable to talk of a realist tradition. Traditions are puzzling things, we all know that. Alistair MacIntyre has an extremely powerful, but also quite tightly drawn notion of what constitutes a tradition and how you can understand it. But one might not want to adopt MacIntyre's understanding in whole or in part, but at the same point, figuring out who is in the realist tradition and who is not is sometimes quite a hard thing to do. And again, that's caught up with some of the things that Vibeke was saying towards the end of Mike and her paper, looking at people like Niebuhr, for example. To what extent does Niebuhr fit into the realist tradition? How can one see him? Yes, he was a friend of Morgenthau's, yes, he was a friend of Kennan's, yes, he was influential on them, allegedly not Kennan called him the father of us all, and so on, but it's still quite hard to see the joins, as it were. So around all of these sorts of questions, when I was starting to think about what I might say or what I might write in this particular paper, it seemed to me that there was one other remark Waltz made at that conference in 2009 that I thought might be worth pondering for a minute. That was when he denied very heatedly, I think in response to Mike, but I may be wrong, that realists need to be pessimists. He made the point that realism is not pessimistic. And he made the point to say, I'm not pessimistic, I'm optimistic. Now, I think if you look at his work, you can see what he means. Somebody who thinks that more nuclear weapons is going to make the world a safer place is indeed an optimist, a very profound kind. And I think Waltz was, to some extent, mistaking what one might call dispositional qualities with philosophical positions. Nonetheless, I think there is something in the claim that the pessimism that realism is often accused of displaying is not quite what it appears to be at first view. And I wanted just to give you one quotation, which is from a very good and very widely used general survey of realism, Michael Joseph Smith's realist thought from David Kissinger. In its most basic outline, the realist picture of the world begins with a pessimistic view of human nature. Evil is inevitably a part of all of us, which no social arrangements can eradicate. Men and women are perfectible. The struggle for power, which defines politics, is a permanent feature of social life and is especially prominent in relation to free states. States act according to their power interests, and these interests are bound at times to conflict violently. Therefore, even if progress towards community justice is possible in some way within states, some realists think it is, others are not so sure, the relations between them are doomed to a permanent competition that often leads to war. I'm suggesting that that is a general view of realism, and it's a general view of realism that is held by people like Michael who are very knowledgeable about realist thinkers. And I don't want to say that it's wholly false, but I don't think it's wholly true either. And this paper is really an attempt to explore how we might look at pessimism, in inverted commas, in its realist form, and what it closer to the pessimism that Joshua Dienstag discusses in his extremely good book on pessimism as a philosophy, and it is not what people normally take pessimism to mean. It is not, for example, necessarily conservative. I mean, it's obviously the case that many political realists from Niebuhr through the war, indeed up to Rawls, would consider themselves men of the left, the liberal left, and in some cases perhaps even more than that. So in a way, the way into this paper is really that set of questions, that set of issues. Now, I call the subtitle for the paper Modernity's Crisis and Realism's Response, and so I need to say something about what I take this alleged crisis of modernity to be. There are, of course, many crises in modernity, ongoing and probably never ending. The crisis to which political realism is, I suggest, one response, one of several, obviously, doesn't appear suddenly and is not wholly of a piece. I think it only becomes unambiguously clear and widely picked up and commented on in the mid to late 19th century. John Burrow, the author of perhaps the most perceptive study of the 19th century intellectual context, has written that sense of crisis drew on three associated contexts: political, social, and cultural. The political was the advent of representative institutions, democracy in other words, based on wide but not necessarily universal adult suffrage. The social was the growth of the great cities with mass populations, with the excitement that cities bring, but also the perceived horrors, its threat to social order and decency, its perceived physical and moral squalor and unhealthiness, and perhaps most of all, its dwarfing impersonality. And the cultural was the moral and cultural vacuum of an age which was increasingly beginning to think of itself, at least in certain sectors, as post-Christian. Now, the sense of crisis was manifest, I think, in many of the writers who most strongly influenced the first generation of political realists, most obviously the circle around Max Weber, which included Simmel and Veblen and others, and all of whom, as Lawrence Scaff has brilliantly shown, were responding to that great diagnostician of the crisis, Friedrich Nietzsche. And of course we know through Christoph Freud's biographical work and many other people's works, some of whom are in this room now, just how subterranean an influence Nietzsche was on Morgenthau, but actually also on some other of the first generation realists like Niebuhr. And in a certain sense, the essence of the crisis was simple enough, in outline. Were the hopes engendered by what one might call the long enlightenment of the 17th and the 18th century, running, as Jonathan Raphael has argued, from Spinoza through to the great figures of the French and the European enlightenment in the 18th century, were these hopes reasonable, or were they in fact illusory? Now, in fact, what I want to do here is to look at an answer that was given to that question, not in the circle around Weber, not by the first generation of political realists in the first instance, but actually 100 years before. Because I think the essence of the crisis was seen, predicted almost, and understood by perhaps the most important philosophical paradigm of the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant. And I want just to say something about Kant and how he pinpointed his version of the crisis before I turn to the realists. The place where Kant's concern becomes, I think, most obvious is in his essay on the common saying that this may be true in theory, but does not apply in practice, which was first published in the Modernity in 1793. Now, it's concerned with a number of issues of relevance to Kant's overall ethical and political outlook, and in the course of it, he engages with a number of his predecessors and contemporaries, most especially Christian Garde, Thomas Hobbes, and Moses Mendelssohn. My concern here is with the third part of the essay directed against Mendelssohn, and its central concern, as Kant announces it in the opening paragraph, is as follows. Is the human race as a whole likable, he asks, or is it an object to be regarded with distaste? Must we simply wish it well to avoid becoming misanthropic, without really expecting its efforts to succeed and then take no further interest in it? In order to answer such questions, we must first answer the following one. Does man possess natural capacities which would indicate that the race will always progress and improve, so that the evils of the past and the present will vanish in the future good? If this were the case, we could at least admire the human species for its constant advance towards the good. Otherwise, we should have to hate or despise it. But we cannot avoid hating that which is and always will be evil, especially if it involves deliberate deliberate and general violation of the most sacred rights of man. Perhaps we may not wish to harm men, but we shall not wish to have any more to do with them than we can help. It's this final view that Kant ascribes to Mendelssohn, and which the third part of the essay on theory and practice is designed to refute. And it's designed to refute it precisely because Kant believes that if you cannot establish a ground on which you can stand, a ground that can underpin the possibility of progress for the human race as a whole, not merely individual progress amongst us, which Mendelssohn is quite happy to accept. If we cannot ground it that, then all of the hopes on which the Enlightenment rests are indeed illusory. And Kant, in some of his later political essays, most famously obviously Nature and Peace, but also in the theory and practice essay and the essay on the idea of universal history and the end of all things, tries to set out a number of different ways that you can plausibly expect progress to be not impossible. The weaker reading of, and I'm obviously telescoping a number of different passages in the text, but the weaker reading of Kant's interpretation of this question is you do not have to show that progress is possible, you only have to show that it's not impossible. If it's not impossible, Kant thinks there is a moral duty to work for it. And that is the grounding of his Enlightenment, and it's his answer to the question that in a sense becomes unambiguously clear by the end of the 19th century, posed most certainly by Nietzsche, which is, is the Enlightenment an illusion? Now, let me come on to political realism. What I want to suggest, and it ties in, I think, quite nicely, quite effectively, but quite nicely with the arguments that Mike and Bielke outlined in their very excellent paper, is that to some extent one can see the realists, particularly the first generation realists, as effectively taking Mendelssohn's argument rather than Kant's. The darkness that they see at the heart of political relations, and perhaps in some cases, at least at the heart of human nature, must be faced. It must be confronted and acknowledged if it is to be faced down. Mendelssohn, in Jerusalem, which is the text that Kant is referring to in the Theory and Practice essay, is very emphatic that understanding that the human race does not progress in general does not in any whit deny the centrality of the claims we might make morally or politically. Mendelssohn was, as Kant was, a liberal. He believed very strongly in constitutional liberal government. He also did not believe that recognizing that the human race itself did not progress was any obstacle to individuals or particular societies progressing in certain contexts. Indeed, he wanted to say in a passage that almost astonishingly prefigures a sentence on Morgenthau's and Scientific Man versus Politics, he wants to say there is nothing in human beings that forces us to believe that they must be evil. Individual human beings can be good or evil. It is our choice. Morgenthau and Scientific Man versus Politics makes the claim. The point that he's making about the tragic necessity of politics is that there is no progress towards the good. One day good, one day evil triumphs in politics and in human beings because that is the nature of human beings. And Mendelssohn would have agreed 100% with that. The point then for the realists is that they are assuming that Kant was wrong. They are assuming that you can argue, if you like, for liberal principles and political values without a ground. The social theorist John Carroll, in a wonderful book, which I've been rereading relatively recently because towards the end of this week, I'm hoping to organize a big interdisciplinary conference on humanism and its boundaries. John Carroll has a wonderful book called Humanism, the Wreck of Western Culture. And in it, he says the Enlightenment was designed to be a culture without shadows. But by the end of the 19th century, he argues the shadows were very long indeed. I think that what Mendelssohn suggests, and what to some extent Niebuhr in particular, and Morgenthau in particular also pick up, is that actually the Enlightenment, by definition, has shadows, because all social processes do. And if Morgenthau doesn't take it as far as Morgenthau famously did in the dialectic of Enlightenment, I think it is worth emphasizing that the position that Niebuhr and Morgenthau represent is effectively a way of responding to the crisis by saying we have to wager that we can establish the political principles we want to establish on the basis of our knowledge of human beings as they are. Does that say?
It's 5 minutes.
Human beings as they are, rather than human beings as we wish them to be, or human beings as somebody like Kant assumes they can be. Another argument that Kant makes in his context, in the context of his debate with Mendelssohn, of course, is what some scholars have called the providentialist assumption, which Hegel later gives the name becoming of reason to. That is to say that nature will force human beings to do things they would otherwise not want to do. I think one of the central things in the realist response to the crisis is a very strong emphasis on human agency and away from the Kantian notion that something else, something in ourselves, in nature and providence, will solve the problem for us. I think if you take this as a potential response to the crisis of modernity, I think a lot of things in the wider penumbra of political realism become comprehensible in ways that perhaps they don't in other contexts. Morgenthau's concerns, many of which were largely ignored by many of those who took his writings on foreign policy seriously, are explicable if you think of it in these terms. For example, his concern with science, the role of science, his understanding of and interpretation of the American Constitution and the purpose of American politics, his admiration for figures like Lincoln, who were people who somehow he felt managed to negotiate this stance, almost existential stance, of taking politics and agency seriously without, as it were, the grounding. And I think if you look at somebody like Niebuhr, I think Niebuhr too is responding, especially perhaps in the work leading up to his Gifford lectures in Edinburgh, delivered in this very fair city in 1939, 1940, about, again, the centrality of agency and why the wager is so important. If you read Human Nature and the Destiny of Man, and you read the exchange, the remarkable exchange he had with his own brother over the Manchurian crisis, when his brother, also a very distinguished theologian, advocated, as it were, a fatalistic response that God will dispose, so we should, as it were, sit it out and let God dispose. Rengger was absolutely adamant that the purpose of human life is in a certain sense action, it's agency, we have to act. And that in a sense underpins Niebuhr's reaction both to the Depression and the work that he did that led up to Modernity and Royal Society, and then the later work he did after the Gifford lectures, Children of Light, Children of Darkness, Nations and Empires, and so on. And interestingly, I think you can see in contemporary realists something of the same response, although in a way they have backtracked from Morgenthau and Niebuhr, and their version of the wager looks suspiciously like Kant's. It is, of course, not providence, but it's the nature of the structure of the system, or the character of the character of the particular state involved. Great powers from Mearsheimer are different from other powers. In other words, there is a sort of providentialist assumption, but it's the other side of the coin from the early generation realists. So it's not so much, it seems to me, a methodological difference, though there obviously are those as well, but rather which side of the wager you want to take. Whether you want to take Kant's route, or whether you want to take Mendelssohn's route. Now, what that suggests, to me at least, is that, first of all, when people suggest, as some scholars do, that the realists are essentially anti-enlightenment, they're wrong. There may be one or two exceptions, perhaps Henry Kissinger, we could discuss that. But generally speaking, political realists are children of the Enlightenment, chastened children perhaps, but children of it nonetheless. And they believe it. And they believe that to secure it, and to secure the values that it stood for, and that in various different ways they stand for, you have to make a wager. Ultimately, John Carroll says at the end of his book on humanism, it's all about a place to stand. And the question that I leave you with, since my time is up, is whether we think the realists, first of all, were correct in assuming there is a place to stand on Mendelssohn's side of the wager, and whether, if there is, it's secure enough to bear the weight they want to put on it. Thanks very much.